What is up, guys? Neo Unstoppable here, bringing you another video on Magic the Gathering. This is part 2 of the series. Just in case you missed the first video, I highly recommend you go back and watch it. I know it's a little bit of a long video, but it breaks down a lot of the different card types in the game, so that's pretty important to the game. You don't absolutely have to watch it, but it's a good crash course in how things work and how things are done. This video, I'm going to be going over turn phases, going to be going over a little bit of different things that, different circumstances you can use to win the game, hand size, things like that. So let's just get right into it. I'm going to take the camera down here. This is one of my decks here, and you can see that there's mountains here and swamps here. So this is a dual color deck. This just so happens to be a vampire deck. You can see right there it says vampire. So it's a tribal deck in other words, and that's what it's referred to as. It's two colors, like I said, so any spells that I have like this, Feast of Blood, will affect vampires or have to do with vampires. That's the best way to build the deck. I'm not going to get into deck building, but I just want to give you guys a quick look at one of my decks so you can see what one looks like. So what is crucial and necessary for a deck, obviously, is having a good balance of lands in it. Okay? You need the correct number of lands because you have to have lands to actually play these cards, right? But you also need to have a good balance of the cards. That way you don't get a handful of all cards. Before I get into turn phases and things like that, you guys should know that a standard hand and one that you draw before you start playing the game consists of 7 cards. So let's just say, theoretically, that this is my opening hand. It has 7 cards in it. So what will happen here is, as far as whether this hand is good or not, which is an important thing in Magic, because in your first hand that you draw, you have an option to do what's called a mulligan. A mulligan is where you look at the cards, okay, you know, this has no lands in it, or it consists of all lands. This isn't something that I want, because it's going to be hard to play with early on in the game. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back and draw 6 cards. Every time you mulligan, you can mulligan as many times as you want, but every time you mulligan, you get rid of that hand and you shuffle it into your deck and your opponent cuts that deck, then you draw 1 less card than what you had before. So I had 7, now I draw 6. Now, this is a pretty good hand, other than the fact that I've got a black card here and a black card here, and I have 2 red lands. So that's not that great. I probably would hold on to this just because the lower amount of cards that you have in your hand, the more dangerous it gets to whether you are even going to be able to survive midway through the game. And you also kind of got to balance this against whether you see your opponent reaction when they look at their hand. If they have a positive or negative reaction, it's a little bit like poker in that sense. You can read that, or if they mulliganed a couple times already, then you know that you're safe to mulligan for a better hand if you have a borderline not good hand. So if I didn't want this, that's 6 cards, I would draw 5 cards. Now, I don't recommend mulliganing down past 5 cards. It's a little bit like hitting at 16 if you're playing blackjack, but you can, in which case you draw 1 less card, you've got 4, and then you draw 1 less card again, you've got 3, all the way down to 0, and you can start the game with 0 cards in your hand. When it becomes your turn, the first turn is a little bit different than the other turns. Okay, so you've got your deck here, right? Different people put this in different places, so I'm not going to say that you have to have your deck exactly right here, but it should be here. Some people will have it to the other side, some people will have it at this type of angle, some people will have it like this, closer to the middle of the battlefield. Especially this is common with like miracle decks and things like that, to where you don't want to be drawing too quickly because you might have something on the top of the deck before, and you want to do something before you draw it, or things like that. But we're not going to get into professional playing or anything like that, tournaments. I'm just going to say you keep your deck like this. So you're going to draw your hand. These are 7 cards here. Okay? And then you look at your hand, but your opponent's not going to see your hand, right? You're going to do whatever you possibly can to make sure that they do not see what's in your hand. Now, in this hand, there's a couple aspects to it that you should note. You want to try not to have too much equipment. Like this is an artifact / equipment, right? So if you have too much equipment, that's not... Equipment can also be creatures, but you want to try not to have too much equipment that attaches to creatures unless you have an equal or greater amount of creatures to attach that equipment to. I've tried to play hands like that and failed. So I only have 1, that's good, right? This is an enchantment aura, so this is kind of like an equipment. This goes on to a creature. Now, we've got quite a few creatures here. We've got 4 creatures, so 2 things that affect the creature, and then we've got 1 land, and this land just so happens to be a swamp. So this is not a very good hand, and I'll explain to you why. So if everything goes good, turn 1, we put this card out, right? We're gonna, if we're going first or not is a debate to whether we are drawing on the first turn, but all that aside, if you look at my creatures here, I know you might not be able to see mana costs. You can see that one. It's clearly a 1 of any color and 2 mountains. As far as mana costs, if you want to go back and refer to the first video if you didn't watch it, now would be the time. So this has a converted mana cost of 3 mana. So this one has a 3 and 1 swamp, meaning 1 has to be a swamp, 3 of any color. So this is 4. This costs 4 mana to play, and these are both the same card. You can have up to 4 of any one card in your library at any one time. You cannot have more than 4. There's really complicated things that I'm not going to go into, like restricted cards and banned cards and things like that. But for casual purposes, and also I'm just going to say that this is a legacy deck. I'm not going to go into standard, modern, all the different types of form playing, just for a general casual player. One thing that I do want to note, though, is that if you have a creature card, or it doesn't even matter if it's a creature card, if you have a legendary card, which will be stated right here, this says creature vampire. If it said legendary creature, I would only be able, I can still have 4 of them in my deck, but I can only have 1 of these out at the same time. If the name is the same and they're a legendary creature, if I have 1 out on the battlefield and I play another one, I have to sacrifice the one that's already out. So you can do that, and there are benefits to doing that, but I'm not going to get into that. It's all technical play. But anyway, these cost 2 and 1 swamp. So these have a converted mana cost of 3, and I have 1 mana. So I've got a 3, a 3, a 3, and a 4 mana cost creature, and 1 mana. This means, for definite sure, I'm not going to be able to play a creature unless I draw one that only costs 1 mana, and it's specifically going to be 1 swamp, or 1 colorless. So that's why this is not that great of a hand. I would probably mulligan this hand, but I'm just using this as a general way of showing you where everything goes on the battlefield and all that stuff. So, this is in our hand, which is concealed, right? Now, this is what it comes to. If you want to roll, flip a coin, or do whatever you want to see who goes first, I've heard that a common way of seeing who goes first is to look at the bottom card of your deck, and so does your opponent. Whichever one has a higher converted mana cost will choose who goes first. I don't like doing that because I don't want my opponent to know what's on the bottom of my deck or their deck, and I don't want to have to reshuffle and all that stuff. So I usually flip a coin or roll a dice. I have 20-sided dice because, like I said, each player starts the game with 20 health points. So I use that dice to keep track of mine and or my opponent's health points. Whoever rolls the high roll gets to decide who goes first and who goes second. Normally, I would say it's not that big of a deal, but it is a big deal if you are playing against somebody that has a red deck. Red decks are typically aggro decks. You do not want someone with a red deck going first, because the more turns they have, the more they hit you with small spells or bring out creatures that have haste, and I'll get into creature effects a little bit later in the video. And the faster they do that, the faster they will kill you. So you don't want an aggro deck going first. Now, if you don't know if they have an aggro deck or not, that's okay. I mean, you'll play against them and you'll find out, or you'll see what color schemes they have as you're shuffling their deck, like I do when I play in tournaments. As I'm shuffling the deck before the game, I take a quick look. I don't look specifically at all their cards, but I do pay attention to what colors they have in there. So I kind of have an idea of what they're going to do. All that aside, just say that maybe you did a coin toss. You lost the coin toss, and your opponent decides that they want you to go first. Now, there's pros and cons. The pros, well, you're one turn ahead of them because it's a turn-based game and you're going first. The con is whoever goes first skips their draw step on their first turn. So just for that first turn, you don't draw a card. That is the only downfall of going first. So if you were to go first, you don't have anything to untap, or you don't have anything to cast during your main phase, so you don't have to worry about the phases. You would just put out this one land, because you have no other lands to put out, and you can put one land out on your main phase, or in your secondary main phase, or your end phase, and we can't play anything, because the only thing that we have to play are 3 mana cost things, and we have 1 4 mana cost thing. Now, this Cryptghast has a kind of an important thing, and I told you earlier in the video that this is a vampire deck, so it's a tribal deck, and you'll notice that it says here, I'm not sure if you can read that, but it says creature spirit. So this is not a vampire. It's not going to be affected by the same thing that vampires are affected by, but it has an ability, or it has a static effect, I'm sorry. It has extort. And what extort does is it always has extort because it says extort on it. What that does is whenever you cast a spell, so whenever I do, I can pay either, and this is kind of a weird symbol. Let's see if I can, oh yeah, you can see it. That is on one side white and on one side black. So it's a white / black. So 1 mana, either a swamp or a plains, so black or white mana, I can tap that when I play a spell, and if I do, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain that much life. So that's really good. Extort is really good if you're playing against more than one other person. But extort is not why this is in here. This also has an ability that says whenever you tap a swamp for mana, which is one of these, it has to be a swamp. It can't just be any land that produces black mana. It has to be a swamp. Whenever you tap a swamp for mana, you add 1 swamp or 1 black mana to your mana pool. So, as an example, if I were to tap this, and this card is out on the battlefield, then this, instead of producing 1 black mana, would produce 2. So you can imagine how that would be really, really good, considering this mana cost for this creature is 3 colorless in a swamp, so it costs 4 mana, so I already am going to have 4 mana out, and say 2 of those are swamps, I can produce 4 mana with just those 2 swamps. So this really ups what's called your mana ramp. And you want your mana ramp to be good, because the better your mana ramp is, the stronger stuff you will be able to put out faster. Now when I say ramp, that means that you shouldn't have all creatures that cost 4, 5, and 6 in your deck. Although those might be really strong, your early game and your mid game will suffer because of that, because you'll have nothing out on the battlefield to defend yourself with. And they will just be hitting you with any 1/1 or 2/2 creature that they put out, dealing 1 and 2 damage to you per turn until you lose the game because you hit 0 life points. Now, and that does happen a lot with red decks, and it's also common with green decks because you usually have 1 mana drops that are 1/1s. So you want to try and make sure that you have something to defend yourself with if you're defensive, or something out there dealing damage that possibly could block if you have that, just to keep you alive until the late game where you're pulling out creatures like this that cost 4 mana. Okay? So if we were to go first, we would put our land out, nothing else would happen, we would skip through all the other phases of our turn, and it would go to the opponent's turn. Now on their first turn, whether they mulligan or not, whatever they have, the first thing they will do is draw 1 card from their library or their deck. After this, then it goes into the next phase, which for the basics of this, I'm just going to go with the general phases. Realistically, there's 14 phases and subphases altogether. But just for the sake of this video and for the basics, because this is all you really need to know, is you've got the beginning phase. So that's your upkeep and all that stuff is all summed up in one phase, and that's your beginning. That's when you untap everything and draw your card. Right? Then the next phase you have is your pre-combat main phase. So there's 2 main phases in your turn. Main phase is where you cast things, and spells, sorceries, creatures, things like that. After your first main phase, you go into the combat phase. So this is the 3rd phase of your turn. This is where you can choose to attack with any creatures you have on the field. Okay? After your combat phase, your secondary or post-combat main phase happens. So this is the 2nd main phase in your turn, where now, again, you can either put a land out if you haven't done so that turn yet, or you can play a sorcery or an instant, or you can play a creature. So say you want to attack with a creature, like say this is the battlefield. The opponent has this creature out, and I have this creature out. And say this has a power and toughness of 3 and 2. So it's a 3/2. This is a 2/2, right? So if I were to, the reason you would play a creature on your main phase is this. I'm just giving you a general idea. If I were to attack with this, what I do is I tap it, signifying that this is attacking. Now, this person has a 3/2, and this is the only creature they have out. So what they would try and do is they either don't block it, and they let this creature live, and they would just take 2 damage. Or what I would actually do if I was the opponent in this case is block this creature with this creature, knowing in my mind that both of them will die because this deals 2 damage to this and it only has 2 toughness. So it will die. And this deals 3 damage to this and it only has 2 toughness, so it will also die. These both kill each other. But the reason I would do this is because this has the effect that makes it so that every time a swamp is tapped, it produces 2 mana. That's a really good effect. I don't want this on the field. So I'm willing to sacrifice my only defender and block this, having both of them dead, especially because now they won't have anything else out to attack me with. So I won't have to worry about getting hit. Now, the reason if this is the choice that happens and they block and this dies, it will first of all go to the graveyard, which is here. And this will also die and go to the graveyard, right? So what will happen, and the reason to cast a creature on your secondary main phase was, in their mind, they just wiped the board, they took off your offensive capabilities. But they didn't know that you left your mana on tap, and now you actually are going to tap that mana and play another creature, so you do have a defender. So maybe it would have swayed their choice differently if you hadn't played this before you attacked. So it's sometimes a wise decision to wait to cast certain things until your secondary or post-combat main phase. After this phase comes the end phase. So during the end phase is just when your turn ends. Okay, so you pass the turn to the other person. And so what happens in the beginning of the game oftentimes, probably like 9 times out of 10 in the first 1 or 2 turns, all those phases are pretty much completely skipped. For example, if I have this out and I have nothing to play for 1 mana, I can't do anything during my main phase. I have no creatures, so my combat phase I can't do anything. And my secondary main phase I can't do anything, so it skips directly from the beginning phase to where I would draw, all the way to the end phase. But I didn't draw a card this turn because I went first. If I had gone second, my turn would look a little bit differently. I wouldn't have that mana out and say, I'm going second. So the first person already went, they put out their land if they had one, and then it went through all their phases. They didn't play any creatures, so the board is completely empty. And then it comes to my turn. So what I would do is I would draw one card because I'm going second. So this is what we're hoping for. This is what we want with this hand that we took. Because we accepted this hand with 1 mana, which is a risky choice, and I would recommend doing it unless you have a really good mana ramp for that. So we just drew a red mana, which is really, really good because most of the things in this deck are going to consist of red, or all of them consist of red or black, but some consist of red and black. So this now opens up our choice to being able to play those, and also we are just 1 mana away from being able to play 4 or 5 of the cards in our hand. You'll notice that this creature here, we can't play him yet because he costs 2 for mountains. So he has to be, 2 of these have to be tapped. If I had, I know it's a converted mana cost of 3, but 2 of them have to be red. So it would have to be 2 mountains and then 1 of any other. Or I can tap 3 mountains if I wanted. So we draw this, and then we just have to decide what we are putting out. So we would put 1 land out. It doesn't really matter to us which one it is because we have no 1-drops. We have no mana. We have no spells or creatures that we can put out that cost 1 mana. If we did, we'd want to put that mana out and play that as soon as we could. The second turn happens, so I go, like I said, I skip through all those phases that I can't do anything with. So I skip through the main phases and the combat phase, goes to the ending phase, and then it goes to the opponent's turn. Okay, they put out another land, they do their thing. If they can play something on the second turn, which is pretty common, so this is when you'll start getting more activity. They might not put out anything for defenders, they might only have 3 drops like we do. It comes to our turn again, so in the beginning. Now, if I would have tapped this, and this was tapped, during the beginning phase of my turn, I untap everything, right? And I draw my card. Now, this is a 2/2 that costs 4 mana. It is also a creature, and it's a vampire. So, we drew our card. Now in our main we have an opportunity to put a land out, so we put that out, and we still cannot play anything yet, unfortunately. Now, like I said, you draw 7 cards, but also 7 is the maximum number of cards you can have in your hand at any one time. So essentially, if you have more than 7 cards, when your end phase rolls around, you need to discard all but 7 cards. You get to choose the ones you keep, you get to choose whatever ones you want to discard, but you cannot have 8, 9, or anything like that, unless you have a card, and typically they're blue, that states that you don't have a maximum hand size, or you can have as many cards in your hand as you want. There are cards that do that, but for the basic rules of the game, you can only have a maximum of 7. So, right now, we have 7, right? Because we've had 2 turns so far, and we drew because we were the second player. They went first, so we haven't had the ability to play any cards yet. We still have 7, and we've put out 2 lands. We've drawn 2, and we're holding on to 7. It goes. We can't do anything, so we skip all of our phases, and it goes to the next person's turn. They do their thing. Maybe they put out a creature. Maybe they don't. If they do, we'll get to that in a second. So it goes back to our turn. We untap everything. If those were tapped, they would untap. If I had any creatures that attacked or they used any abilities that required them to tap, they all untap during this step. And then we draw another card. Now, this is an artifact, and it's an artifact equipment. So, essentially, what this does, it's called Blade of the Bloodchief. Now, whenever you have an artifact equipment, it will always have an equipped cost. This one, I know you might not be able to say it, but it'll say equipped and then a number next to it. This one is 1. So it also costs 1 to cast it. So, we can play this. So what we would do with this, so if it costs 1 to equip and 1 to cast, we have to cast it first. Once this is on the battlefield, it's a permanent, and it stays on the battlefield until it's destroyed by somebody else. Or you, if you choose to destroy it, you have to have a card that does so. So this will take 2 mana to do what it needs to do, because you got to put it out and then you got to equip it on something. It can't attack by itself. It has no power and toughness, nothing like that. It is a card that it affects a card that it is put on. Okay, so what the effect box tells me right here is whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature. So whatever creature this is equipped to, that's what how it'll affect it. Now, if equipped creature is a vampire, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead. Okay? So, for example, everything in my hand, except for this and the aura, they're all vampires except for the Cryptghast. So everything else is a vampire. This is kind of a complicated deck to show you a first game with, because a lot of things have really weird effects that work really good together with other vampires. This is a perfect example of that. This creature has Intimidate, and it also has another ability. I'm not going to get into that. I don't want to overcomplicate it, but I'll just say, if I already had this creature out, I know I don't have the mana. This costs 4 mana, so I wouldn't be able to put it out. But if I did, just in a theoretical way, and my turn starts and I draw this card, right? I would tap 1 colorless mana, so it can be whatever mana I want. It can be any color of mana. It just has to be 1. All right, so I tap 1 to put this out. And its equip cost is 1, so it's out on the field. So I tap 1 more, and I equipped it to this, right? So what happens is it goes under it like this. I put them like this so that you can see the name of what it is. And then, obviously, whenever you play it, your opponent might say, oh, I don't know what that card is, and they'll read it, and they'll figure out what it does, or you can explain it to them. I usually do. So what this will do is, whenever something dies, it doesn't matter if you kill it or if they sacrifice it, or however it dies. Maybe it says, you know, sacrifice this creature after the first turn it comes out, whatever like that. Then it's just whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. So if they discard a creature, that doesn't count, because it specifically says they have to be on the battlefield and they have to go in the graveyard. So however that's happened, that will affect it. So this is a vampire. So instead of the normal thing that happens, it would get 2 +1/+1 counters. I went over the power and toughness in the other video, but if you didn't watch that video, the power and toughness is affected by the +1/+1 things that happen. So it could be this creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. It could be anything like that. But this is specifically talking about counters. So I'll show you what that looks like. Here, I've got my dice bag. I've got several different types of dice here. These are 20-sided dice. I use these for counters, and then I also use these standard-sized dice for counters. I'm going to use these standard-sized dice. No, actually, I'll use the small one because I can see it clearly on the camera. So if a creature gets really big, I'll drop out another one of these 20-sided dice if it's affected by that many counters. But typically, the smaller ones suffice. If you put enough counters on something, it can essentially be a 20-20 and just kill the other opponent in one unblocked attack. Now, we'll say that this is the creature that they have to defend with. Alright? Now, so this has this on it. It doesn't affect it in any way unless this effect is triggered by a creature going into the graveyard, right? So for whatever reason, let's say that this creature, they don't attack and block and fight each other, but this creature is out and I cast something that kills that creature. Okay, so this goes to their graveyard. Now what happens is this gets a +2/+2 counter on it. So I just do this. Now some cards will give it +2/+0, or +0/+2, or +0/+5, or whatever, okay? So if you're doing that, then yeah, you can do 2 different dice, toughness and power separately. Maybe it's a +5 +2. So then I will know that this number is added on to its respective number here. So this would be a 7, 4, for example. But since the numbers are even, and I know it gets +2 +2, I'll just drop a +2 +2 counter on there, and now I know that this was a 2, 2. Now it has +2 +2 on it. Now, just in theory, with this +2 +2 counter on it, this thing wouldn't be able to kill it, because this is a 3, 2, and this has got 4 toughness, so it's only getting dealt 3 damage, and it's got 4 toughness, so it still can take 1 more damage before it was killed. Now, if I blocked with this, and these 2 things fought each other, and then the opponent casts a spell that says deal 1 damage to target creature, then yeah, this would die, and also so would this. So saying that this dies, right, and this dies, would do this. This would go into the graveyard, but this is an equipped artifact, so this does not die. This just stays on the field, and it's still a permanent, but it's not attached to any creatures, so its effect doesn't really do anything. But its effect could do something if it was a different artifact that did do that. So essentially, that's how counters work. That's the basics of how combat works. Like I said, over here is your graveyard. Some people have an exile pile, which when a card is exiled, it's different than putting it into your graveyard. A card that's exiled is removed completely from the game. Some people just flip the cards over that are exiled and put it next to their graveyard. Or they put it completely off to its own pile somewhere at different locations. You don't necessarily have to have a setup like this, but you do have to have whatever's active on the battlefield in this zone right here. You have to have your mana here. As far as that goes, you can realistically put things wherever you want, up to your personal preference. You can have your deck this way, you can have it this way. A lot of the time when I play in tournaments, people put their deck all the way over here. So, and then this is the battlefield all next to it, and I get maybe because it keeps the graveyard a little close right here. Some people that play specific with dredge decks, which I'll get into dredging and things like that in a different video, but when people play with those type of decks, sometimes they have their mana up a little bit, and they have their whole entire graveyard spread out like this. So they have access to everything in their graveyard. You cannot change the order of your graveyard. So let's say that these things are in your graveyard, and we'll just put this over here for a second. So let's say that these things are in your graveyard, right? This died first, this died after that, so on and so forth in this exact order. So anyone can view your graveyard at any time. Your opponent can, and you can. So when you're looking through it, and you do this, that is not okay. That's against the rules. This has to be in the order that things died in, because certain cards affect the top or bottom card of your graveyard. So that's something that I didn't know, but I'm sharing with you guys. This has to stay in the same exact order that it was in. So, but people with certain decks that access their graveyard a lot, or move cards from their graveyard to play or exile them, will like to have their graveyard more accessible and easy to see. So there's no specific way to organize it, but typically the game is played in the fashion that I showed you. The mana where it is respectively, and the graveyard being here. Like I said, you can move the deck, anything like that. So we covered phases, we covered where your mana is, tapping mana, playing things. And the next video I'll do is going to be on combat, and it's going to be on different effects that creatures can have and how those effects matter in battle. So if you guys like the video, I encourage you to hit that like button, subscribe if you're into gaming or if you're into card games. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.